I'm slow in letting go. What lies underneath will show in time. The demons deep below will come here. We hide in the underground. We dream a world around. Our busy brains ignore the sound of crying. It's easy to romanticize the past. I only want to leave a thing that lasts. Time will pass, it surely will.
To travel west, you really had to go by water. That was the preferred and favored way of traveling. And you couldn't go west through Buffalo or Erie. I mean, that would take a large vessel. And you have to remember, too, there was very little money. People didn't have money. The waterway, like the rivers, were the preferred way of traveling. They were clean, they were safe, and they were free.
Look at the geography, the geology of our maps in our region. Cattaraugus County has the Allegany River flowing south-southwest through its county into north-central, northwest Pennsylvania, on down southwest to the city of Pittsburgh, meets the Monongahela, forms the Ohio, into the Mississippi. Our Genesee River flows due north, as does the Niagara River, flowing due north. You are so close to Ontario, be it at Detroit, Windsor, be it at Buffalo, Fort Erie, any place else on down the Great Lakes chain, Lake Ontario, and downriver to St. Lawrence. Any number of places there that utilized water. Everybody was well aware of slavery and our problem right from day one. It lived very strongly in the South because of the different climate, and slaves could be productive year-round as opposed to seasonal here in the North. So later it's been called that peculiar institution, prospered very well in the South. People in the North at this time, you never traveled more than 50 miles from home. There was no reason to, you had no means to do so. But now, with more of the runaways coming into the North, some of them being accepted and living in the area, people were hearing firsthand about the evils of slavery. So more people got involved in it. One of the greatest sources for anti-slavery movement came from the American pulpits, especially in the North, because the vast majority of our people could not read nor write, and they would get the vast majority of their news, if you will, from the pulpit. Here were the preachers pounding about the inherent evils of slavery, so people were becoming much more aware of it. As far as taking a stand one way or the other regarding slavery, that was not the common cause, or not the case in the 1820s, 30s.
The Seventh-day Baptists, like the Quakers, were very devout people. Not everybody saw a person of color as a person. In accordance with their beliefs, these slaves and these oppressed people and everything, they still were men and women. They still were people.
The Methodist Church, as representative of many of the mainline Protestant churches in the North, experiencing this ordeal of how active do we get involved in this political, secular movement? How active do we get involved as a church body?
And the Wesleyan Methodists left the mainstream Methodist faith because they would not condemn slavery. Wesleyan Methodism was formed because it was an abolitionist faith.
Presbyterian Church split, and it wasn't until about 1970-71 when they got the two factions finally together over 100 years after the war ended and formed Presbyterian Church USA as we know it today. Baptist Church split. We have American Baptist and we have Southern Baptist, and I doubt they're going to get together for quite a while. Here in Allegheny County, Frederick Douglass visited here twice, around 1850, 51, 52.
Probably during the Civil War and just before, Frederick Douglass was the most famous Black American in the United States.
The accounts that we have of Frederick Douglass's first visit to Allegheny County was announced in his newspaper a few weeks before he came. An absolutely wonderful description of how he saw Allegheny County.
The first time he was not overly cordially welcomed in many churches throughout Allegheny County. In fact, he was rejected in many places because he was too radical, too revolutionary. It was not the popular thing to do yet.
Olean was founded in 1804 by Adam and Robert Hoops. They were brothers and they were officers in a Revolutionary Army. After the war, they went to work for the Holland Land Company. They were surveyors, so they really had the pick of the property they wanted. Most of New York State, other than Long Island and New York City proper, was owned by the Holland Land Company. Adam and Robert picked Olean for the site because of its proximity to the Allegheny River and also the abundance of timber. It's hard to move timber around, and what they would do is they would take this lumber and build them into rafts. In the springtime, they would have the lumber all ready to transport down to Pittsburgh. They'd go down there and unload and turn around and walk back. And of course, that was the most common mode of transportation, is walking. Robert was actually down here running the business, and he didn't run it very well. It went under, and the land reverted to the Holland Land Company. In fact, Adam died penniless. You know, he lost everything he had. He never realized that actually this was going to be the gateway to the West. You remember in 1804, when Olean was founded, Thomas Jefferson, president at the time, with one stroke of the pen, he doubled the size of the country. This was kind of like a chock-a-block tent village because people were temporarily here going west, and some of them stayed.
Here in our particular part of the southern tier of New York, there were slaves in Allegheny County in the early days. But that certainly soon died an economic death as well as being outlawed or made illegal by the 1830s clear across New York State.
We don't have an awful lot of detail of the early black people and what they did. We know that they were farmers, largely just like anyone else. They arrived in what was then Friendship. They arrived in the late 1820s because they showed up in the 1830 census. Sometimes marked on the census as B for black, other times M as mulatto. You see this all of the time in censuses. They were owners of land, marked as literate, voted.
By the 1830s, there was many slaves that risked running away. And 1840s, you could help a runaway slave and have no legal repercussions whatsoever.
But then in 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, all of a sudden it became illegal to help runaway slaves.
The South was suffering a major economic loss in these runaway slaves because a healthy young slave on the slave auction mart cost upwards of $1,000. That was a year's salary. Southern legislators went to their fellow legislators in Washington, D.C. and said, pass a law that helps the South. Our government has always worked on the premise of compromise. You want something, I want something, we both can't have it. Where's that proverbial gray area in between? So the North said, in particular, we hate seeing slaves being sold in the street corners of Washington, D.C. And the South said, well, all right, we'll agree to stop that, but you pass a fugitive slave law, making it illegal for people in the North. And the Northerners agreed to that. So the Great Compromise Act of 1850 was born, of which one part was this fugitive slave law.
However, there were a number of very brave, very daunting individuals who said, I'm not going to let that law, which is an evil law, prevent me from helping people to become free.
The Underground Railroad came into being when helping slaves became illegal. The few on that bell-curved tail adamantly refused to obey the law, and they helped the slaves. They were willing to be arrested.
You had this happening not only in western New York and Allegany County and Cattaraugus County, Steuben County, you had this happening all over the Northeast.
So this law further stated that if you knew your neighbor had a runaway slave, you were compelled by this law to report your neighbor to the sheriff. And people said, well, if I do that, I'm putting that slave back into slavery. And I'm not only putting a slave back into slavery, but I'm perpetuating slavery by doing so. So if you're going to obey the law of man, you violate the law of God. So this is what they did. They would report to the sheriff. Sheriff, 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 Joe below down the road has a slave and I have to report it. And the sheriff goes, all right, that's a prosperous farmer. Are you sure you saw that? I'm not wild about going out there and arresting him. This is a leading citizen. We all know what the golden rule was. I can hear your mother telling you now what the golden rule is. Well, there's another golden rule in life, and that is he who has the gold makes the rules. When did you see this slave on Joe Blow's farm? And the man says, 2 or 3 days ago. But I was busy plowing or harvesting or chores in the farm, and I couldn't get away to report it, but I'm reporting it to you now. And the sheriff says, that was 3 days ago. That slave is in Canada now. Got his log cabin half built. So that's how people in the North satisfied the letter of the law of man and resolved their guilt with their Christian conscience at the same time.
If you were black, regardless of whether you were an ex-slave, you run away, whether you have established yourself in a community, whether you were always free, if you were black, you were in danger of being what they called impressed.
Another side of this was the case of a man named Van Tuyl up to the north of here. I think it was Penn Yan. Van Tuyl had stolen 2 young black boys, and he got over the border of Pennsylvania and was heading south, and he succeeded in selling one. The man who had stolen the 2 black boys had less of a sentence put on him than another man in the same session who had stolen 2 horses.
Bounty hunters, armed with the Fugitive Slave Law, would come and get you and yank you back, yank you to down south, regardless of your status here. But here is a black woman, deeded a house. Now, how out can you be? You know, and if that doesn't say a lot about Olean, New York, I don't know what does. When slaves did come to Olean area, they were welcomed and they were sheltered and protected. The most popular ex-slave that we know, who is a legend in our own right, is Sarah Johnson. We know that she, by her own statements, that she befriended Dr. Andrew Mead, and she was his housekeeper, and she taught her how to be a midwife. It must have been like 3 or 4 generations she could have helped into the world in some way or another. So she had a hand in, the growth and the birth of Olean. Sarah was a slave on the Merriman plantation in Baltimore, Maryland. Her owner's son told her one day after his father had died that she was going to be sold. Let's say the plantation is Olean, that's all you've known. And out there, out there is a whole new world that you don't even think about. All right, you're 13 years old. All right, and you have to make up your mind to go, because you do know that if you're sold down south, that's how bad that's going to be, because you've heard the stories from other slaves.
Oh, Lord, Lord, if I ever get back home, I never do wrong.
You gather your things and have to gather your things. Don't know where you're going, don't even know what you need. So you get as much as you can, bread and stuff, and go up on the hill at night, hoping they won't find you. What a decision that must be, to head out. Safety is down there, but not so. Because if you go back, you're going to be sold, punished, and then sold. So you got to move on.
Lord, I'll be back home.
New York is right in the heart of the Underground Railroad, the underbelly of New York being Pennsylvania and Maryland. And a lot of the runaway slaves fled from Maryland up through Pennsylvania, and in western New York, the goal was to get to the Great Lakes, and most specifically to Lake Ontario.
So it was very easy for the slaves to utilize those waterways. When you visualize those bloodhounds with big floppy ears, their senses of smell is 1,000 or more times better than ours. And those ears stir up the skin on the grasses, and that's what they smell. They cannot smell that in water.
Maryland, 300 miles away, about roughly, traveling that way at 13 or 14 years old with nothing but what you have on your back. I can't even envision it. You imagine how dark Olean gets at night. Can you imagine in the woods, not knowing where you were going?
But just think of what that meant. Some of those slaves were on the road for 2 months, traveling 8 to 10 to 12 miles a night, many times barefoot, not having a clue where they were, having complete, total faith in their drive to be free and to experience freedom.
John Quincy Adams was a very poor president, but he's a wonderful congressman, especially after his presidency, mainly because he advocated against slavery so vehemently.
A few people were radical anti-slavery. We'll do anything to help the slaves and eliminate slavery in the South legally and otherwise. A few over here were not necessarily in favor of slavery, but by now there were numerous reward posters paying $500 or $1,000 for information and the rest in the capture and the return of the runaway slave.
People didn't have money in the rural areas. They existed on what they could either raise themselves or barter for.
Van Tuyl had nothing to do with the slave catchers. He just got a great idea, go get himself some money.
I saw that slave the other day in Olean or Portville or wherever in Belmont. Go to the sheriff, turn the slave in, get your reward money. That was a year's salary. And I defy anybody to say they would not have been tempted by that had you been alive in the 1840s and 50s.
In passing from Belfast to Friendship, I had an opportunity of seeing something of wealth and beauty of Allegany County. The wealth consists in its pine forest and its beauty in its lofty hills. A visit to Allegany for the mere purpose of enjoying its scenery and drinking from its crystal streams would quite repay the lover of nature. Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass in 1851, after he spoke at the First Baptist Church down in the village here, and then went out the same evening and spoke to a Seventh-day Baptist group in Nile, he went on to Cuba about 2 days later. So in other words, a day's rest. I'd say we 98% certain that he stayed at Lanfear's house in Nile. Well, I think that you could say that Ethan Lanfear, for his day, he made a fair amount of money because he was able to travel a lot around this country. One of his ambitions was to visit every Seventh-day Baptist church in the country. Lanfear moved over to Friendship in 1844. We are not absolutely certain as to when he met Frederick Douglass. In his autobiography, he said that he harbored Frederick Douglass while still a slave.
So by 1852, when he made a second round, he was more or less very welcomed in the majority of our churches, with overflowing crowds hearing him speak.
The one that he spoke before at the Baptist Church in Friendship was not only highly enthusiastic, but he described them as being very well informed.
I found at Friendship an audience assembled to hear me, alive with interest, frank, intelligent. Death to kidnappers is by no means an unpopular sentiment in the neighborhood of Friendship. Frederick Douglass.
What we see as the Seventh-day Baptist, the old Seventh-day Baptist Church, they built it right where the present Seventh-day Baptist Church building is. They left that 32 by 40 foundation exposed so that today you can see right where it was. By guesswork, you can kind of stand in a place where you've probably figured, just from what we know of the configurations of these churches, in an area where it's very likely Frederick Douglass spoke, and especially he walked around or whatever.
Let's back up and talk about some of the practicalities, if you will, of the Underground Railroad and how it affected us here. The Underground Railroad is one of the great mysteries of American history. A great deal is known, a great deal isn't known. And it's pure speculation because it was illegal to do it. You didn't hang a shingle out in your front yard that says B&B, runaway slaves, welcome here for the night. You find your little caboose sitting in jail. It was not done that way. It was all secret, by code, and by sheer guts. The vast, vast majority of people were not involved in the Underground Railroad.
Sometimes people picture this as some kind of a network that had been set up with a house every 30 miles or whatever, and it didn't really work like that in a lot of areas. In many cities or even rural areas, there were people who were abolitionists who were operating right in the same area. In a city, sometimes it could even be blocks from one another. They never had any idea that each other were doing it.
You don't know who was identified with what Underground Railroad stop. So there are a lot of names and so forth you just don't know. And you don't know a lot of dates because it wasn't a history that people wanted to air.
So it was just the people who, for the most part, were well off, well-to-do, well-established, that had this automatic command of respect from their fellow citizens because they've made it in the 1850 society. So we're talking prominent homes that were large enough to hide a slave in a hidey hole or a back stairway or a secret stairway. There are a few places that we know for sure on waterways in Allegheny County that were stops, safe places on the Underground Railroad. There's a house in Elmond called the Crandall House, now called the Lindeman House, privately owned. Don't go there expecting to get a tour because that's not fair to the occupants. Just leave them alone. Another great spot is a house in Belfast, still standing right on the outside of the nasty curve on North Main Street in the hamlet of Belfast. Look at its location to the river. River is just a couple hundred yards away. And that was a very prominent family. The sheriff's deputy would think twice about going out there and arresting that homeowner. So those places all have first-person accounts, family diaries. So there was proof left behind, but very, 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 very little.
Sarah Johnson was not a conductor, but an Underground Railroad station master. When runaway slaves would come to her house, now take in consideration now, she's on Irving Street. Now, Irving Street in Olean, right now, there's Irving, and there's Green, and there's the dikes, and there's the river. But way back then, there was not the space. She would sit in her rocking chair, and sometimes she would see the slaves coming down the river.
If you were to figure out the causes of the Civil War, it's not just one. It's not just like World War I started with the Archduke Ferdinand being assassinated, World War II starting with the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor. It wasn't a sudden drawing of America into the war. Revolutionary War was 1780s, and the issue of slavery was not resolved there. And it was fermenting and ferventing over 75 years with many, many causes. And this Underground Railroad of the 1850 was the final act, if you will. War was inevitable.
People that you see every day, you don't think that their ancestor had this kind of history, but it's true.
We have a rich heritage here. I think we should explore that. I think we should give our children and our children's children a reason to think about, well, what's the history here?
These are the things to think about for us to appreciate.
And believe me, if you feel that anybody has made a difference in Olean, New York, and don't know about Sarah Johnson, I suggest you either get in touch with your librarian or your historian, because you need to know about that woman. If nothing, it will light up your own life.
The Civil War was a defining period in American history. As Shelby Foote so eloquently stated, succinctly stated, it made us who we are. They'd gone beyond the point of reconciling it, of compromising. It was now bloodshed, the only way the issue would be resolved.
I'm slow in letting go. What lies underneath will show in time. The demons deep below will come here. We hide in the underground. We dream a world around. Our busy brains ignore the sound of crying. It's easy to romanticize the past. I only want to leave a thing that lasts. Time will pass, it surely will. Your years underneath the sun, fresh face where lines will come, the burning bodies of the young and fearless. How long will it take to fall? How long before you hit the wall? I'd banish all from rise and fall if I could. It's easy to romanticize your past. I only want to build a thing that lasts. Time will pass, it surely